The curse on Amalek was meant to be a permanent judgment, a means of ensuring that evil would not endure within Israel's borders, but Saul's disobedience allowed that evil to persist, setting the stage for future conflicts and challenges. The story of Amalek also invites us to consider the nature of divine justice. The command to destroy the Amalekites was harsh, and it may seem difficult to reconcile with our modern understanding of mercy and forgiveness. Yet, in the context of ancient Israel, this command was a reflection of God's commitment to protect his people from corrupting influences. The Amalekites, through their unprovoked attacks and their deep-seated hostility, had become a symbol of opposition to God's purpose for Israel. By commanding their eradication, God was seeking to preserve the integrity of his covenant and to safeguard his people from those who would lead them astray. The story of Amalek, Saul, and the curse pronounced upon the Amalekites reverberates as a powerful lesson about the nature of God's justice and the enduring consequences of disobedience. Saul's failure to fully execute God's command serves as a reminder that compromise, especially when it comes to matters of faith, can lead to unforeseen and lasting repercussions. By sparing Agag, Saul left a door open for the Amalekite influence to resurface, a choice that would affect Israel for generations. The appearance of Haman centuries later was a chilling reminder of this. Haman's hatred for the Jews and his plot to destroy them is a direct continuation of the enmity between Israel and Amalek, a feud that had been allowed to endure because Saul failed to carry out his mission completely. The repercussions of that decision show how disobedience to God's commands can have ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate moment. The story of Haman and Esther exemplifies the resilience of God's chosen people and his protection over them, even in the face of relentless enemies. Haman's downfall was orchestrated by the hand of God, working through Esther to save her people from annihilation. Yet the fact that Haman, an Amalekite descendant, rose to a position of power and nearly succeeded in his plan to destroy the Jews illustrates the danger of allowing even a trace of rebellion to survive. Saul's choice to spare Agag may have seemed merciful or pragmatic, but in doing so, he had unwittingly placed future generations of Israelites at risk. The survival of Amalek's lineage allowed the spirit of opposition to God's people to continue, manifesting itself in Haman's plot, which threatened the very survival of the Jewish people in Persia. The curse of Amalek also highlights a difficult aspect of divine justice that challenges our understanding of mercy and judgment. The command to eradicate the Amalekites was severe, and it is natural to question why such a harsh decree was given. Yet this command was not one of blind vengeance. It was a measure intended to preserve the spiritual purity of Israel. God knew that the Amalekites, with their deep-rooted hatred and violent tendencies, would continue to pose a threat to his covenant people. By removing them entirely, God was protecting Israel from an influence that would undermine their faith and lead them away from him. The story of Amalek serves as a reminder that divine justice is often beyond human comprehension, and that God's commands, though sometimes difficult, are given for the ultimate good of his people. Through the failure of Saul and the subsequent actions of Samuel, Israel learned a profound lesson about the cost of partial obedience. Saul's attempt to rationalize his disobedience by offering the best of the Amalekite livestock as sacrifices highlights a common human tendency to justify compromise. In his mind, Saul believed he was honoring God by using the Amalekite wealth as a form of worship. But this reasoning was fundamentally flawed. God's desire was for Saul's complete and unwavering obedience, not for sacrifices made out of disobedience. The lesson here is clear. When it comes to following God's will, there is no room for negotiation or personal interpretation. Obedience is not measured by our intentions but by our actions, and partial obedience is no obedience at all. This story also underscores the theme of trust. Saul's disobedience was rooted in a lack of trust in God's wisdom. By sparing Agag and preserving the livestock, Saul demonstrated that he valued his own judgment over God's command. This decision reflects a deeper issue within Saul's heart, one that revealed his inability to fully trust in the righteousness of God's decree. This lack of trust ultimately cost him his throne and his relationship with God. In contrast, Samuel's actions demonstrate a complete and unyielding trust in God's plan, even when that plan required difficult and painful choices. Samuel's commitment to fulfill God's command, even after Saul's failure, serves as an example of the kind of obedience that God desires from his people. The curse of Amalek and the story of Saul's disobedience resonate with future generations as a cautionary tale, one that emphasizes the importance of following God's instructions to completion. This narrative became part of Israel's collective memory, a reminder of the consequences of rebellion and the importance of trust in divine wisdom. For the Israelites, the story of Amalek was not only a historical account, but a moral and spiritual lesson that guided their understanding of obedience and faith. This story served to remind them that their covenant relationship with God required unwavering loyalty and a willingness to surrender personal judgment in favor of God's commands. In the centuries that followed, the story of Amalek continued to be recounted as a symbol of the dangers of moral compromise. The Amalekites became synonymous with opposition to God and his people, representing a spirit of defiance that had to be eradicated to preserve the sanctity of Israel. This association with rebellion and disobedience reinforced the importance of obedience in Israel's religious and cultural identity. The memory of Amalek served as a warning to future generations about the high cost of disregarding God's instructions and the consequences of allowing even a trace of opposition to remain. The story of Amalek and the curse pronounced upon his descendants is a narrative that continues to hold relevance for those who seek to understand the nature of divine justice and the importance of obedience. It challenges us to reflect on the ways in which our own actions may carry consequences far beyond what we can see. Saul's disobedience was a single act, but its repercussions extended through the ages, affecting not only his own life, but the lives of countless others. This story reminds us that our choices have a lasting impact, and that obedience to God's will is not merely about following rules, but about placing our trust in his wisdom and his plan. The story of Amalek also invites us to consider the nature of opposition and rebellion in our own lives. Just as the Amalekites represented a persistent enemy to Israel, we each face our own challenges that threaten to pull us away from our faith and our relationship with God. The story of Amalek serves as a metaphor for the struggles that we encounter, reminding us that these challenges must be confronted and eradicated if we are to maintain a life of faithfulness. Like the Israelites, we are called to be vigilant against the influences that seek to lead us astray, to remember the lessons of Amalek, and to trust in God's guidance as we navigate our own journeys. The legacy of Amalek's curse is one that speaks to the enduring power of faith and the importance of obedience. It is a story that reminds us of the cost of compromise, the necessity of trust, and the unwavering justice of God. The Amalekites were not simply enemies of Israel, they were a representation of opposition to God's will, a force that had to be confronted and removed for the sake of Israel's spiritual integrity. Through this narrative, we are reminded that God's commands are not arbitrary. They are given with purpose and intention, guiding us toward a life of righteousness and peace. The story of Amalek and the eternal curse pronounced upon him is a reminder that obedience to God's will is not just a duty, but a path to a deeper relationship with him, one that transcends time and generations. The story of Amalek begins long before his name becomes synonymous with Israel's sworn enemy. It is a tale rooted in ancient rivalry, passed down through generations and marked by a curse that would haunt his descendants. Amalek was a grandson of Esau, the elder twin brother of Jacob, whose descendants would become the 12 tribes of Israel. In a fateful moment of hunger and impatience, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of stew, a choice that would forever alter the course of both families. Jacob, later named Israel, inherited the blessings of the firstborn, establishing a divine covenant with God. Yet Esau's descendants, among whom was Amalek, carried a resentment born from that exchange, a bitterness that would manifest itself in the lineage of Esau and mark the Amalekites as perpetual adversaries of Israel. As the Israelites journeyed through the wilderness after their escape from Egypt, Amalek and his people saw an opportunity to strike. In a cruel and calculated ambush, the Amalekites attacked the weary and vulnerable among the Israelites. They did not confront the strong or engage in open battle. Instead, they preyed upon those who lagged behind, the elderly, the weak, and the defenseless, showing a merciless disregard for human dignity. This cowardly assault not only enraged Moses but also invoked God's wrath. The attack was seen as an affront to God himself, an act of hostility against his chosen people, and one that would not go unpunished. God declared through Moses that he would utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under the heavens. This curse was to be a lasting judgment, an eternal condemnation of the Amalekites' treachery. Moses recorded these words, ensuring that the command to remember Amalek's offense would be passed down through Israel's generations. The Israelites were to hold this memory close, to keep alive the story of Amalek's betrayal, and to await the day when they would be commanded to fulfill God's decree against him. This vow of retribution would become a defining aspect of Israel's relationship with Amalek, a reminder of the justice that awaited those who defied God's covenant with his people. Years passed, and the Israelites eventually settled in the land promised to them, yet the memory of Amalek lingered, a shadow that hung over them as a reminder of unfinished business. When Saul, the first king of Israel, ascended to the throne, he inherited not only the leadership of a nation, but also the responsibility of executing divine justice. Saul was a man chosen by God, anointed by the prophet Samuel to guide Israel and protect them from their enemies. He was tasked with fulfilling the command that had been recorded generations earlier, to destroy the Amalekites completely, leaving no trace of their existence. This was not a battle of conquest or territorial gain. It was a mission of obedience, a test of Saul's commitment to God's word. As Saul prepared to lead his army against the Amalekites, he understood the weight of this command. This was a solemn duty, one that required absolute faith and adherence to God's instructions. Saul was to spare nothing, neither people, livestock, nor possessions. Everything associated with Amalek was to be eradicated as a symbol of God's judgment. It was a harsh directive, one that underscored the gravity of Amalek's crime and the seriousness with which God viewed disobedience. Saul knew that this was not a task to be taken lightly, yet he could not anticipate the challenges that would arise from within his own heart. When Saul's army defeated the Amalekites, he stood victorious. But in the midst of his triumph, Saul allowed himself to waver. He looked upon the spoils of war, the wealth and the livestock that could be offered as sacrifices to God, and he hesitated. Rather than destroying everything as instructed, Saul spared the life of Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and kept the best of the livestock. In Saul's mind, this act of preservation was not disobedience, but a form of tribute to God, a way of honoring him through sacrifices. However, this decision would prove to be a grave misstep, one that revealed a flaw in Saul's understanding of obedience and trust. The prophet Samuel, upon hearing of Saul's actions, was devastated. Samuel was a man of deep faith and unwavering commitment to God's will, and he had hoped that Saul would prove himself worthy of his anointing. When Samuel confronted Saul, he was met with justifications and excuses. Saul insisted that his intentions were pure, that he had only spared the best for the sake of worshipping God. But Samuel's response was swift and uncompromising. He reminded Saul that obedience to God was of greater value than any sacrifice, that to obey was better than to offer the fat of rams. In sparing Agag and the livestock, Saul had chosen his own understanding over God's command, a decision that would cost him dearly. Samuel delivered a message to Saul that would mark the beginning of his downfall. God had rejected him as king. This rejection was not merely a personal failure, but a public declaration that Saul had failed in his role as the leader of God's people. The curse upon Amalek was left unfulfilled, tainted by Saul's disobedience, and the repercussions of this choice would echo throughout Israel's history. In a final act of adherence to God's command, Samuel himself took up the sword and executed Agag, completing the task that Saul had left undone. This act was a stark reminder of the seriousness with which God viewed his commands and the consequences of failing to uphold them. The story of Amalek and Saul is one that serves as a powerful lesson on the nature of obedience, trust, and the dangers of partial faithfulness. Saul's failure to fully carry out God's decree highlights the complexities of human judgment and the ways in which our own desires can lead us astray. The curse upon Amalek was not merely an act of vengeance, but a symbolic reminder of the consequences of defying God's people and, by extension, God himself. Through this narrative, Israel was taught the importance of following God's commands without deviation, a lesson that would resonate for generations to come. The curse on Amalek and the subsequent failure of Saul to fully eradicate the Amalekites were not just isolated incidents. They became a defining mark on Israel's journey, one that would haunt them for generations. The Amalekites, spared by Saul's disobedience, would continue to be a thorn in Israel's side, rising again in future conflicts and reminding the Israelites of the dangers of failing to follow God's commands to completion. In sparing Agag, the Amalekite king, Saul allowed the lineage of Amalek to persist, and this act of leniency would lead to repercussions that extended far beyond his own lifetime. The consequences of his actions serve as a testament to the enduring impact of decisions made without total trust in divine wisdom. The legacy of Amalek's curse did not end with Saul. Centuries later, in the time of the Persian Empire, the Amalekites would reappear, this time through the actions of a descendant of Agag, known as Haman. Haman, an Agagite, rose to a position of power under King Xerxes and harbored a deep-seated hatred for the Jewish people, a hatred that led him to orchestrate a plan for their complete destruction. The story of Haman is recounted in the Book of Esther, a narrative that illustrates the long-reaching consequences of Saul's disobedience. Haman's animosity toward the Jews and his plot to annihilate them can be seen as a continuation of the ancient feud between Israel and the Amalekites, a feud that had been allowed to persist due to Saul's failure to eradicate Agag's line. In a twist of fate, Esther, a Jewish woman who became queen, was able to expose Haman's plot, leading to his downfall. But the story of Haman serves as a reminder of the lasting effects of Amalek's curse and the dangers of leaving God's commands unfulfilled. The curse on Amalek was not merely a matter of retribution for past wrongs, it was a divine decree that held symbolic significance. The Amalekites represented more than just a rival tribe. They embodied opposition to God's chosen people and, by extension, to God himself. In this sense, the command to erase Amalek from memory was not about vengeance, but about removing a source of evil that threatened the covenant relationship between God and Israel. The Amalekites had become a symbol of rebellion against God's authority, a living reminder of what it meant to defy the divine will. By sparing Agag, Saul had allowed this symbol of rebellion to endure, undermining the very foundation of Israel's faith and commitment to God. Saul's actions also revealed a flaw in his character, one that would ultimately lead to his undoing. His failure to fully obey God's command reflected a lack of faith in God's plan and a reliance on his own judgment. By choosing to keep Agag alive and preserve the best of the livestock, Saul demonstrated that he valued the opinions of his people and his own reasoning over the clear instruction given to him. This choice to compromise reflected a deeper struggle within Saul, a tension between his role as king and his relationship with God. In attempting to please both God and his people, Saul lost sight of his primary duty, to serve as an instrument of God's will. His actions serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of divided loyalty and the cost of failing to place full trust in God's guidance. The prophet Samuel, who had anointed Saul as king, was deeply grieved by Saul's failure. Samuel had believed in Saul's potential, hoping that he would lead Israel with integrity and devotion. But Saul's disobedience was a betrayal of that trust, a reminder that even the anointed leaders of Israel were not above God's law. When Samuel confronted Saul, he did so with a heavy heart, yet his words were clear and unyielding. He told Saul that his rebellion was as sinful as witchcraft, that his stubbornness was akin to idolatry. These harsh comparisons underscored the seriousness of Saul's actions, emphasizing that partial obedience was no obedience at all. By sparing Agag, Saul had not only failed in his duty, but had committed an act of defiance against God's authority. In a moment of profound sorrow, Samuel declared that God had rejected Saul as king. This rejection was not just a loss of status, it was a severing of the divine relationship that had once bound Saul to his role as Israel's leader. Saul's kingship had been a gift, a position granted by God's favor, but it was now revoked due to his disobedience. This moment marked a turning point in Saul's life, one that would lead him down a path of jealousy, paranoia, and ultimately despair. The story of Saul and the Amalekites is thus not only about a failed mission, but about a lost connection with God, a reminder of the tragic consequences of choosing one's own path over divine direction. Samuel's sorrow did not end with Saul's rejection. In his commitment to fulfill God's command, Samuel himself took up the task of executing Agag. This act was a painful duty, one that Samuel undertook out of obedience rather than vengeance. By putting Agag to death, Samuel sought to bring closure to the unfinished task that Saul had abandoned. But the implications of this act would reverberate throughout Israel's history. Samuel's role in this story serves as a stark contrast to Saul's, highlighting the difference between reluctant obedience and faithful adherence to God's will. In executing Agag, Samuel underscored the importance of completing God's commands fully, even when the task is difficult and the cost is high. The tale of Amalek and the curse pronounced upon his people is a story that resonates with deeper themes of faith, obedience, and the cost of compromise. It is a reminder that God's instructions are not open to interpretation, that his commands are given with purpose and clarity. Through the story of Saul's failure, we are reminded of the dangers of relying on our own understanding, of placing personal judgment above divine wisdom. Saul's decision to spare Agag may have seemed justifiable in the moment, but it was a choice that bore consequences far beyond his own reign.